Hello, everybody. Welcome back from a little break, little mini break there for Thanksgiving. Today we're going to jump into a new unit. I also wanted to kind of let you know a little bit about the situation with final exams and final grades, because that's all resolved now, and I'm sure you're probably thinking about it. So before we begin, does anybody have any questions about the sort of end of semester timeline here? If I just real quickly pull back out into this module. So as you may have guessed, we have 2 weeks, basically, of class. We have this week, and then we have next week. And then this little half week, we have class that upcoming the Tuesday. And then after that, we have the final exam. Our semester calendar that the university put together, you may have already noticed, is a little weird. It's a little non-standard this year for reasons that I just don't fully understand. But I personally have never had a final exam that was this late before. But it's what we got. So, and I'm required by university policy to give you the exam on the exam date that was assigned. So, apologies that it was so late. We don't really have much of a choice in terms of those dates, so we'll just have to kind of deal with it. So, I have just a couple of things to say about this last date. Basically, what I'm hoping to do is the deadline for us to submit grades, I was able to get an extension on that. So I believe that our deadline right now to submit grades is December 26th. My hope is for me to basically be able to submit final grades immediately after the exam, like within 24 hours. That's what I'm aiming for. So you should have your final grades submitted to the registrar after, right after you take the final exam. The last day for you to turn in assignments for a grade is the 16th of December, okay? And that's sort of the deadline that the TAs need so that they can work with me to get your grades done, and then they can go off on break. And then, I guess if you have any other questions or concerns about the timeline for final grades or the timeline for the final exam, definitely let me know. I usually, historically, I don't really give out the exam early because, that creates a maybe possibly unfortunate opportunity. But if anybody has any extenuating circumstances or any any reason why the exam date doesn't work for you, let me know and I'll see if we can work something out. Does anyone have any other questions, I guess, about anything? Yes. No. Or maybe I should say, heck no. No, absolutely not. And that would really be awful. I'm expecting that most of you will be already traveling by then, so it's an online exam. The format is pretty much the exact same format as the midterm. The only difference with the final is that it covers content that takes place after the midterm in the course flow. And then the other difference between the midterm and the final is that the final has at least 1 or 2 questions that require you to submit a file. So, for example, there might be a question like, make an image that is this many pixels and this color. And because of that, because of those couple of questions, I hand grade those. When I say hand grade, I mean I clicky grade them. But yeah, those questions will prevent you from getting an automated grade. I actually will have to go in and hand grade some questions. So like I said, I'm just hoping to get on that like immediately after the period for the final ends. And I can usually get through them pretty quickly, so you should be able to have your final grades. So what I'm hoping that you all will have access to by the 17th, which is the day after that final grading deadline, that is when you all should be able to go into Canvas and see all of your grades except for the final. So does that clarify all that for you? Okay. All right. Well, any other questions before we kind of move into the content? All right. So kind of the content for today is we're moving into this section considering code. I have obviously a lot to say about code. As we get started today, I think that I'm going to show you these Intro to Coding in the Arts slides. With the coding section in general, I think that what you'll be seeing me do in class is actually coding. I'm not going to sort of like lecture code concepts. If you're interested in having those concepts sort of spelled out for you in like a really careful and regimented way, I would recommend that you look at the slides for the next 3 weeks. I'll be using those slides just kind of as a guideline to kind of pace myself through concepts in class, but I'm going to show you those concepts as we would write them in code. And if you wanted to, you could certainly, this would be one of your best study tools for sort of referring back to things that I talk about in class. So I am going to talk about all this stuff. I'm just not going to like stand here and read you functions allow you to execute actions, blah, 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 blah. That's like, we're going to do it in a much more kind of interactive way. So, but these slides are loaded with lots and lots of, I would argue, essential information regarding the code techniques that you need to know to complete the assignments. So I would definitely take the time to sort of like, read through them. I think you might find them helpful. So as I said, I'm going to be using the slides as kind of a guide to like talk broadly about all of these things. And we're going to be working in a certain sort of code editor. And that code editor is called P5. So we probably will spend a little bit of time talking through why we have chosen P5 as a code tool. But for now, we're just going to be sort of like doing it. I have, I guess, just to kind of let you know, like, I have probably, like, if I were to list like the 2 things that I'm most skillful at, code would be on that list of 2 things. So I definitely have been doing it for an awful long time. I think that there are lots of different code platforms to choose from. And we will spend some time talking about different code platforms and kind of why you would or wouldn't want to choose one over the other. I don't think we're going to get too deep into that discussion today. I think I'd like us to just kind of get our feet wet and sort of see what happens with this particular system that we've chosen. But that sort of all to be said about code is that in general, there is no one code language that will, open up a fantasy world of like wealth and, friends or whatever. Like, it just doesn't exist. Any code language that you learn, it's likely that you will, if you're working seriously in code, it's likely that you will have to learn more than one. It's likely that you may even have to learn more than 3 or 5, depending on the environment that you're working in. But what we're trying to really emphasize through this code thing and these 2 weeks of code is to sort of really think about general concepts. So a lot of people ask me like, oh, if I learn how to use P5, will I be able to make apps? I'm like, well, yeah, I guess, sure. You can, yeah, yes, you can make an app in P5. However, does knowing P5 make you an app developer? No, that's probably where the other 5 languages come in. Because most sort of like software-oriented projects or code-oriented projects that are complex enough, you may have to leverage more than one language. It's just how it works. Been doing it for a long time. I can say that with absolute certainty. So what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to sort of like expose you to some general concepts that if you do take a class in the future where you have to learn a specific language, you might have a pretty good idea of like, oh, I don't remember exactly like where the curly brace goes on that, but I'm pretty sure I remember seeing something like this. And it will be much more understandable to you than if you had not looked at any code at all ever. So that's sort of my spiel about that. So we are going to be working within the P5 editor environment in this class. If you're interested in using P5 for advanced projects, and you have maybe your own web server or you have access to a web server, if you're interested in sort of like opening the gateway to that, send me an email and I can send you a link to some more advanced setup instructions. But because we assume in this class, Art 107, that you may have never used a code tool before to create artistic images like ever, I don't sort of start at the advanced level, I start at the beginning level. And that's what we're going to do today. So here's the editor, and usually for these three weeks, I have, for every sort of day that we teach class, there should be a sort of thing of links and tutorials. So here are the links and tutorials for this class. These are supplemental. They're meant to sort of just give you more exposure to the concepts that we're looking at in class. If you need a really well-produced video tutorial by this ultra charming academic from NYU, Daniel Schiffman. We have a bunch of his videos linked in here, and he's probably one of the best code workshop guys out on the scene right now. So his videos are really fantastic. And then I have some of my code examples listed here. I have a collection of code that I'm sharing with you all in here. And I went ahead and I linked the entire collection from the module that we have today. So that's right here, Meg's Complete P5 Code Collection. But inside these sort of daily links, I link the specific tutorials that are, or the specific code examples that are relevant for the day that we're working on in class. And partially that's because you just might not know, okay, variable scope. To the uninitiated, that might sound pretty vague. So I'm just kind of like trying to organize these with the day that we're actually having class to be a little bit more helpful than having you just search through the list. And then there's a couple of other sort of general things that we can just check out on today's sort of day. Obviously, the video will come up later. For every day that we do code in class, I'm going to post whatever we work on, whether it's finished or not. I'm going to post it to this link, Code from Class. Obviously, this is from the spring. I'll update it for this semester. And so you should see one of these links for every day. And then the last link that I want to kind of bring to your attention is the p5.js big reference link. And this is something that you could easily access from within the editor, but I want to just kind of make it extra special certain that you know where it is. This is basically like your Bible of how you do anything in P5. So it's got every single command that exists in P5. And if you click on one of these commands, it'll give you a page. And we're going to talk at length, either today, probably today, and the next class. We're going to talk at length about how to actually use this reference. Because I'll tell you a secret. Most programmers don't know every word or function in the language. They have a superpower that I'm going to tell you about. I'm being a little, maybe a tiny bit sarcastic here, but they have a superpower. It's called reading the manual. And reading that manual is basically this website with the reference. So nobody has an entire language memorized. That's just not really kind of how it works. So being able to like really use the reference is probably the most powerful tool that you have, to sort of assist you with this project of learning how to code. Okay, so that pretty much explains, I think, our sort of what's listed on the website. And so a couple of things I guess we can probably get into today. So we're going to talk about what the basic rules of p5.js are. We're going to talk about basic sort of structure of how we make something work in code. So we'll talk about these things called statements and then also how they're executed. And then we're also, just to sort of like not make it completely boring and dry today, this is like the boring and dry day, we're going to put some basic shapes in our thing, and maybe if we're lucky, we'll move them around. So, because definitely like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today is kind of like rules and form. So there's one sort of basic structure for a P5 sketch, and if you're working at an advanced level, this structure is potentially changeable, but I would not, if you're working at the beginning level, which I assume that most people are, I would not mess with it. I would stick to this format, in other words. So what you see are two blocks. So anytime you see like a bunch of lines of code together, that's sometimes referred to as a block. It's kind of common sense, not really important. I also want to maybe introduce you to the editor. So you can see the editor has a couple of things going on. It's got a preview window over here. It's got the code, looks like there's code in here, and then also you have your sort of like line numbers. The line numbers can be useful later on when you're doing an activity called debugging, and I can absolutely guarantee that you will be doing some debugging. It basically means fixing whatever you did. I think this is one of the areas where in order to succeed, you have to make mistakes. So don't kind of be afraid of making mistakes because it's just code. You can always fix it, no problem. In fact, I think sometimes it's better to make mistakes with code because if you make a mistake with like a painting or something, I mean, how do you even fix that? Here we can just change a line and rerun it, and it's better. So as I was kind of pointing out about the IDE, or the Integrated Development Environment, that's an acronym that you may sometimes encounter, we have a preview window, which is going to basically display whatever you're coding. And then we have this codey part. And then we also have these two buttons. And the two buttons are, oh my God, they look sort of just like they would look like on a physical remote control. The one is play, and the other is stop. And for the most part, they do what they're advertised to do. So when you want the code to run, or when you want the code to execute, you would press play. And if you want the code to stop running, you press start, or press the stop button. There is this auto refresh button. Now, the auto refresh button is something that I actually prefer not to check until I'm certain that I want to check it. Sometimes, if you have it checked by default, it will kind of put you in a loop where you can't uncheck it. So we'll talk about that later. But for the most part, I would leave it unchecked, especially if you're just starting out. And then, of course, we get these awesome sort of auto-generated random file names from the P5 people. So you'll get these like really dramatic, I think actually Dramatic Trout was one of them that I got a couple days ago that made me laugh a little bit. But yeah, so you can put whatever you want in here. I'm probably going to put something like November 29th. in class. Now, if you're thinking about saving your code, maybe you might want to hold off for a second and go ahead and create an account. Probably the fastest way to do this is by linking it to your Google account, if you're comfortable with that. But you have to be signed in to the P5 editor online in order to be able to save your code. And then it will sort of behave as normally. So the cool thing about the P5 editor, one of the cool things about using the P5 editor online is that if you all are having problems in your code, and I'll probably demonstrate this multiple times. Let's say you're having problems in your code and you are signed in and you save it. You can see it generates this unique URL. You can email me that URL and I can help you with your code. Oh, isn't that nice? So if you are asking for help with your code, that's sort of what I would ask you to do. I'm a pretty efficient code troubleshooter, so if you do get stuck, please don't sort of like suffer in silence. Just send me an email, and I'll email you back pretty quickly, probably, with a solution. So yeah, that's my suggestion, basically, is that you save it, and in order to save it, you have to be fully signed in. If you do happen to get a URL that looks like this, that means you're not signed in. It means you're either not signed in, or it means you haven't saved your document. So just sort of, I'm going to go ahead and save this. And actually, I'll go back here. OK, so anyway, this is sort of my original example. I'll stick with this one. So if we were to sort of play this code right now, a whole lot of nothing will happen. Not nothing, but almost nothing. So if we put it in, we get this pale gray box. So in code, in code language, that might be described as like a hello world. In other words, it's sort of a notice that something is happening, maybe not much, but something. So if we wanted to sort of think about having more happen, we need to sort of spend a little bit of time talking about these two blocks. So these two blocks of code, one is called setup and one is called the draw loop. So setup is right here. The setup loop, or the setup function, is basically everything that's included in between those two curly braces. Now, do you really need to know what a function is at this moment? Not really. We can probably wait a little bit on that. There are other places where you would potentially make functions as part of your sort of coding. For now, kind of all we really need to know is that these two functions are required. They're required by the P5 editor, so they have to be there. And they're sort of, they have different, no pun intended, different functions. So the function of the setup function, or maybe if we were to be a little less crazy, the purpose of a setup function is to do what? Well, the purpose of a setup function, this is going to shock you, it's to set things up. And so what does that mean, though? I mean, thanks, Meg, it sets things up. Well, basically anything that you have to like load as part of your sketch, any sort of settings that apply to the entire sketch. And by the way, you may notice that I'm using the word sketch. When I use the word sketch, I'm using it to basically sort of apply to the entire thing. That's basically like your project, your code. So the setup function, in this case that we have in front of us right now, it's doing one thing. It's using the create canvas method to open up a 400 by 400 pixel box. And so it makes sense that that would go in setup because something like a window, right? Like you probably want that for the entire run of the sketch. So that's a very setup-y thing to do. There are all kinds of other things we can put in setup, but we will sort of just stick with this for now. Now, the draw function does something a little bit fancier. The draw function will executes basically a fancy word for run. It will run once every frame. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically, I'm going to make some comments here, and we'll talk about comments in just a second. So the setup function runs once at the beginning, and this draw function runs continuously. And you can actually control how often it runs by using a command in the setup function, but we're not quite ready for that yet. So what do we mean when we say, oh, it runs continuously? Well, probably I'm just going to try something here. Try printing something out. So this is a common sort of strategy that I use to debug my code, which is using the print function. And in this case, I'm printing the word draw. So if I run this code, there's two things that are happening. One, the draw function is setting the background to 220. So that happens to be this gray color, is the 220. And then where it says print, it's actually printing to what's called the console. The console, pretty much the console's sole purpose in life is to talk back to you, the human, who's actually writing the code, so that you can solve problems and debug. So it's really common when I'm coding personally, or when anybody is coding, to print things to the console to give the person who's coding a little bit of information about what's happening so that they can code more successfully. So in this case, we're just illustrating, well, every time this number goes up, by the way, that's an iteration or an execution of the whole thing. So just as I've been sitting here kind of yakking, this code has iterated almost 4,000 times. Okay? So we're going to come back and back to this like a billion times. So don't worry about, if you don't totally understand what's happening. Now, over here where it says print draw, I'm going to leave a message for myself. And again, let's pretend that you're in a grim fairy tale and you're lost in the wilderness, right? That's definitely how coding can seem, that you're lost in just these trees of text looming at you, and you're like, crap, I can't even remember what I did 2 lines ago. How am I even gonna get through this? You can leave yourself messages. And that is probably the #1 way, if you're new to coding, it's one of the #1 ways that you can sort of facilitate your own understanding. So here, where it says background, I can leave myself a note that says maybe something like pale gray. So I can also here print the draw, and here I can say something like prints to the console. And granted, that might seem fairly obvious, right now, but there are lots of functions that are much more mysterious than print. They might not even conform to a sort of plain language word. They may just be a collection of letters, in which case having that sort of note to yourself is key. It's key. So let's talk about another way that you could use comments. So I think what I'm going to do here is, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about inheritance. So we have, let me just make sure I'm hitting all this stuff. Right. Okay, so a couple of things. Let's talk about this thing right here. So this line, and you can see that there are 3 other moments where we have kind of the same format, which is some stuff, some parentheses, some stuff inside, a semicolon. That's the formula, right? That is called a statement, okay? So a statement is like pretty foundational. So let's make another instance of the background statement. And let's make it something totally different. So this is going to be black. And what I'm sort of hoping for, and it's not going to work, I can tell you this right now, it's not working on purpose. So what I might think that would happen is that this would turn the background black, right? Does anyone want to sort of guess at some reasons why, if we run this, we will not actually get a black background? I can think of 2 major reasons, yeah. Yeah. So in code, I'm going to write this down on the board, but you could, for those of you at home, you can totally just imagine what I'm saying. If you have statement, 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 code is read and executed in the order in which it is received. And it goes from the top down unless you tell it otherwise. So in this example, you can see it probably did execute this statement, and then within the very same frame, it got this other statement, and it said, oh, well, I'm doing that instead, right? Because that's the more recent in terms of the order that it's reading. So when you have this sort of conglomeration here is a function, but when you have a list of statements, those statements are always going to read and execute top down. So let's see if we can just kind of get around this for a second. So I think what Meg is saying is that if I take this and I put it down here, that background will actually appear black. And that is correct. Okay, so we'll come back to this idea of program flow multiple times over the next couple of weeks. It's really kind of like the foundation of how to start to really do stuff in coding. So yeah, definitely the order in which the statements were listed is a huge consideration. Another sort of, I mean, that's actually really the only consideration that matters, right, at this moment. So let's just say, like thinking again about how to sort of do things here, what if there were a way of still having both of these on the screen here, but sort of only selecting one at a time? Well, there's multiple ways of doing that, but the way that we're concerned with right now is to make a comment. So I can actually just add the double slash that notes a comment, and I can turn off or on any line of code with that. So kind of thinking about how you may or may not kind of debug something, like if you can turn things on and off, that can be a really powerful way to sort of test to see if certain lines are working, other lines are not working, that kind of thing. Before we go any further, I just want to see if anyone has any big questions at this point. No? Excellent. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to probably do is I'm going to go ahead and draw a shape. So one of the shape primitives, which is what they're called, so if we wanted to go to in the shape part of the reference, they have all of these 2D primitives. Probably, especially for the first assignment, I would recommend that you stick with 2D stuff. You can do 3D stuff if you're an advanced user. By all means, WebGL it up. That'd be great. But if you're just learning, I think it would probably be a lot better to kind of stick to 2D. So there's a bunch of 2D primitives, and I'm going to use the ellipse primitive. I'm going to go ahead and just code it in right now, but I do want to show you the reference page and kind of how to use the reference page for this. So with the ellipse, it takes what are called four arguments. So I'm going to go ahead and just make them all 100, which makes it kind of easy and simple. And then, of course, I do need a semicolon at the end. It is the P5 editor has been tending to leave off the semicolon. And technically, that's kind of okay. I think that if you're learning, especially, it's a really good idea to maintain the semicolon because it's just like, you don't necessarily want to take shortcuts if you don't know like how to get down the road, you know? So basically, that's just my opinion. My recommendation is that you use semicolons. If you don't use semicolons and you kind of don't know what you're doing, you can get into some problems, and it can cause problems. So here's my sort of ellipse, and I'm pretty sure, just from my own terrible memory, that this is width, height, and then, actually, I'm pretty sure it's x, y, width, height. So this, again, just a little note to myself to kind of remember what these numbers correspond to. And if you're looking for a sort of word for these numbers, this is a function call. We're calling the function ellipse, and we're passing through arguments. So these numbers that go inside this portion of the parentheses are referred to as arguments. So if we look at the reference, let's see how that lines up with the reference. Yep, yay, I remembered. So you can see here under the syntax section of the thing, it basically gives you letters for the arguments. And then down here it says, okay, x stands for the x coordinate of the center of the ellipse. And y, which is the second argument, is the y coordinate of the center of the ellipse, so on and so forth. So that's basically, in a nutshell, that's like how to read a reference page. And I do think that, you know, sort of like knowing a little bit about how to read the reference page is like, it just opens up a whole world of possibilities. And I do happen to have like a fair amount of P5 memorized, but like, why would I if there's this wonderful reference that I can just like refer back to? I can like vacate that brain space for something else. So let's go ahead and press play here and see what this does. All right. So there you can see we have our sort of ellipse, right? Probably I think what I would like to do in the last couple minutes here is I would like to go ahead and make another ellipse. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the visual stacking. So as we said, this is the x and y. So if I take this one down to 200y, oh, that might be too far. Let's see, 150 maybe. Right. So now you can see that the one that is 150 pixels down is basically covering up the other one, right? Quick thing. Where did I get that number, like 100, from? Did I just pull that out of thin air? Pretty much, except our canvas is 400 by 400, so I thought 100 would be like a nice kind of like in the middle-ish number. Now, you might be asking yourself the question, where is 0, 0? And I can show you where 0, 0 is with code. I can just take one of these ellipses and draw it at 0, 0. And so just like in reality, or just like in your 5th grade math class, maybe, 0, 0 is in the top left. So it's most pretty like common sense-ish for most people to wrap their heads around. That the top left is like usually, at least in this culture, like where we start stuff. So yeah, that's where 0, 0 goes. So now, if we wanted to reorder these and put maybe the one that goes on top, the one that's on top now, we can just flip the order around. So I'm going to go ahead and flip these over here. And I'm just going to change the numbers around a little bit. So instead of moving this pair, I'm going to put this pair at like 200x. Okay. And now I'm going to take this one and just put it behind this one. And so now you can see just, different stacking. Stacking is totally a choice that you can sort of intentionally use, but it's good to know sort of how that kind of comes up into code. So as far as today goes, let me take a quick look at the slides. Yep. Okay, well, there's one more fun thing that we can do, and this is just sort of like to get something a tiny bit more exciting happening. How about for this ellipse that's sitting right here, instead of drawing it at 0, 0, I'm going to draw what are called, I'm going to use system variables. So system variables are basically like, they're listed in the reference. They're basically variables or ways of storing data that are sort of built into the language. And so one of them happens to be mouse X, and one of them happens to be mouse Y. And you can guess what they reference. They reference the X coordinate of your mouse, or they reference the Y coordinate of your mouse. So if we were to run this, so what makes variables so powerful, one of the things that makes variables so powerful is that instead of a static number like 100, mouse X has the ability to change every time the code runs. Yes?
What happens if you set the width and height variables to mouse X, mouse Y?
Cool stuff. Yeah, let's do it. It'll make it kind of like glommy, stretchy, weird. So there's our width and height, now referencing the mouse X, mouse Y. So this idea of variables, we can totally get into this. This is probably pretty much what we're going to be working on next class. But for the assignment that we're working on, the image assignment, you can start to dabble in some of the more advanced kind of code techniques that we're discussing if you wish. But what we're specifically asking for the image assignment is that you generate shapes on the screen. And you can do that pretty much through whatever means you choose. If you're a first-time coder, I would suggest that you generate the shapes on the screen thusly. Is there an easier way to do it? Maybe, but that's next week. So yeah, sort of just familiarize yourself with the coordinate system by drawing shapes. So next class, we're going to talk a little bit more about variables, and we're going to start to talk about color, too. So we haven't really talked about color at all. The color right now is pretty underwhelming, let's say. But we can sort of like get into that with a full clip. Does anyone have any more questions before we break up for the day? My sort of prescription for you is to just try out some test sketches and see if you can get used to how this works, because we're going to ramp up pretty quickly. Okay, thanks a lot.